Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. First of all, Happy New Year! And in this first video of the new year, I want to talk to you about a acoustics report, an automated analysis by Genelec and their GLM system. They basically released this automated report system called GRADE at some point about a half a year ago. And I think it's really interesting. So I just wanted to give you kind of a run through, show you some of its quirks and features, and obviously figure out who this is for and if it's any good. So with that, let's jump right in. Basically, this is what it looks like. So GRADE stands for the Genelec Room Acoustic Data Evaluation Tool, I guess. So think of it kind of like running Room EQ Wizard and then compiling a really extensive report on all the things that this measurement tool spits out. It works with all SAM-enabled Genelec monitors. So if you've got a SAM monitor and you've got the latest GLM system installed, I really recommend you give this a shot. I won't show you how to do that here. The main problem is obviously that I don't actually have Genelec monitors. So what I'll be looking at is one of their sample reports. This one in particular is on a standard stereo setup with a subwoofer, but there's also a sample report on a much more kind of complicated, extensive Atmos system, which I'll link in the description as well. And there you'll also find the instructions on actually exporting or creating this GRADE report yourself if you're using a SAM monitor. All right, so what does this include? Well, it's basically kind of three main parts. At the beginning, you get an overall summary that extracts kind of 5 main metrics from all the data that it captures and puts it together in a nice little table. It's actually really useful, and I'll show you in a second what that looks like. Then you'll get the kind of detailed analysis looking at the frequency domain, the time domain, and then what Genelec calls the time frequency domain. I think this is quite useful. Actually, I might just steal that from you, Genelec. It's calling the plots like the waterfall plot and the standard reverb plot a time frequency domain analysis. And then all that is followed up by the ITUR BS1116 compliance, which is another way of classifying just how good or if you meet certain targets with the acoustic performance of your room. It's quite nice that they included this. Again, I'll talk about that in a second, but let's just start going through it and see what we get. So at the beginning, it tells us a whole bunch of stuff about kind of the measurement, when the measurement was taken. It also spits out the dimensions of your room, hopefully, probably automatically as far as I gather, which is quite useful. So you could use that in a kind of room mode calculator. Additionally, if you wanted to, there's also some kind of information about your particular monitors. It then tells us about what this the scope of this report is really all about. And that's when we get to this summary. So here are those 5 main metrics that I just mentioned, right? I'm just going to flip this on its side so we can see what these actually are. So we get the operational room response. And this is basically an assessment of the quality of the frequency response according to that ITU recommendation that I just mentioned, right? So again, all these 5 metrics are kind of extracted from the detailed data that follows in the rest of the report, and then it's summarized up here, right? So you get this quality assessment in terms of frequency response in percent. Then we get an assessment of the early reflection level. As we'll see, this is actually the first and highest peak in the impulse response. Then we get the early versus late sound ratio, both of these, by the way, measured in decibels, which is basically an assessment of how strong the room response is in relation to the direct sound from the speakers, right? Then we get a T60 RT60 assessment. So this is kind of how flat your reverb time is across the entire audible spectrum. And then at the end, we get there a description of just how bad the worst dip is in the low frequency region of the frequency response. So it's quite interesting because we get these 5 metrics that really condense down pretty much all the relevant information, or all the different aspects rather that a room response encompasses in the time and in the frequency domain. And I think it's really useful that they did this. So it's a mix of their own assessment of quality. Yeah. So for example, the early versus late sound ratio is kind of a metric that they extract themselves, and they just kind of set themselves. And we just flip this back to the right side up, and we can see down here what the kind of thresholds for each of these metrics are. But so it's basically a mix of something some numbers that they extract from the ITU recommendation, and some that they just kind of decided on themselves. And it's a really quick way to assess the quality of your room. And I think it's great that they did this, because it's really easy if you don't want to dig into the numbers and you just want to have a quick view of whether you improved something after a certain change, or where the kind of the worst problems still are in your room response. It's pretty good. I like it. So then we get into the detailed analysis, and it starts with the frequency domain analysis. We basically get a frequency response measurement for each speaker in the system. So in this case, we get the sub first, and then the left and right speakers. On top of the actual measurement, we get the kind of correction curve, the calibration curve, if you will, that the GLM system came up with, and then the resulting calibrated frequency response of that particular speaker. We see here in the sub, we're talking about frequencies in the bass region, and then for the individual main speakers, this is across the entire audible spectrum. How useful is this? It's interesting enough. As you'll see, we can reference back to this plot once you look at some of the other data. So on its own, this is interesting, but not crazy kind of informative. So, but then it comes up with kind of the first more useful plots. So this is both of the main monitors, the frequency response of both of the main monitors on top of each other. And this is great. This is something I've talked a lot about in some of the videos I've done on measurements, because it tells you how similar the response is between the two speakers, and that will give you an idea of the quality of the stereo image, right? So the more similar the two responses are, the higher the quality of the stereo image will be. And then it follows that up with a highly smoothed response. So this is 1 octave smoothing. And again, this is actually quite useful because it tells you subjectively what the system sounds like. Yeah, so this is much closer to how our ear actually hears the speakers. I think they could have gone with 1/3 octave smoothing, but it's a matter of personal preference, if you will, just how far you take the smoothing. This is definitely good enough to get an impression of what the system sounds like. We also get another filtered frequency response for the subwoofer alone. I'm not entirely sure why this is in here on top of what we got before, but hey, why not? So then it talks about the volume of the different speakers and whether it's the same, right? So you get a description of any kind of compensation was done to any of the speakers in order to bring them up to the same level. Again, this is quite interesting to know, because obviously if you want a proper centered phantom center in your stereo image between your main left and right speakers, you really need those speakers to be at the exact same volume. So this is quite interesting. And then it tells us whether the room actually extends or cuts off the natural response of the speaker, right? So if there are standing waves in your, well, there will be standing waves in your room, but the question is whether that standing wave pattern will actually kind of chop away some of the low frequency response of your speakers, or whether it actually extends that. And so that's what this tells you. And this is great to see because you can't judge this unless you have really accurate data on the individual speakers. And obviously, Genelec, doing this with their own speakers, they know exactly how they should perform. And so we get these very detailed descriptions of just how much the room is affecting the low frequency extension of the speakers. At that point, it then goes on to an analysis of the actual peaks and notches in the frequency response. And so there's a large explanation here of some of the potential causes for those peaks and notches. I'm not going to go into that in any detail just yet. Let me just show you what that looks like. So we get the kind of graph that we saw before, but now it marked certain parts of this analysis of this frequency response with these data points, and then it gives you kind of the numbers in a table. It doesn't tell us exactly how it determines or how it decides which of these it actually marks. So why not this one? I don't know. It doesn't tell us, but maybe there's something going on behind the scenes that kind of prioritizes certain peaks and dips depending on the actual response of the room. I'm not really sure. It's still useful, and by the way, here we get the same for obviously the main speakers. That was the sub before. This is still useful because if you do any changes to the response of your room, if you do any acoustic treatment, this should give us a much quicker way to see whether you got any individual improvements on any of these dips and how great they actually are. And obviously, this is all for the response before any calibration, so that you can actually see whether any treatment you put in the room has the desired effect. It then goes on to the time domain analysis. And this is where we're looking at the impulse response in particular, right? And it calls it the time of flight analysis. The main thing here is that we want our speakers, or the direct sound from our speakers, to arrive at the listening position at the same time, again, for the purpose of imaging. And so this tells us just kind of what that looked like before any calibration and then also after any calibration. In this particular report, these are pretty much exactly the same. I can't really see any difference between them, and that is obviously because there was no compensation, right? So in this case, these speakers were set up with kind of perfectly time aligned, and so we don't actually need any time of flight compensation. It also shows us this impulse response for the subwoofer. Again, I'm not entirely sure why we'd want to see this. It doesn't tell me anything directly at this point, but maybe there's something here that I'm not seeing or I'm missing. If you have any idea, feel free to comment in the comments. It then goes on to early reflection analysis, and this is really where it becomes interesting in terms of reflection control, right? So we again see the impulse response, but this time kind of bracketed to the first 30 milliseconds. And then it does a little analysis of the individual peaks that it seems or deems relevant. Once again, we don't really know how it picks these behind the scenes. For example, why didn't it pick this one? Possibly because it's actually closer to this minus 10 dB threshold, as we'll see. But it then also marks where the created comb filter has its main dip in the frequency response. Yeah, so this is really, really useful because with the associated data, you can actually start experimenting, figuring out where that reflection in your room actually happens to then get rid of it. As you see here, it's a fairly high up reflection, or the first dip is fairly high up in the frequency response, and it's not that strong. One reason is because it's 10 dBs down below the initial arrival of the direct sound. But it then also tells us what the kind of resulting ripple of that comb filter is. It's basically how strong the comb filter is on the frequency response. And that's why we kind of see this from this dip kind of diverts down by about 2.3 decibels from 0. Yeah, and that's what this shows us. Yeah. Here's the same for the right speaker. In this case, that dip is almost minus 15 dB down, so the ripple is much less. And the funny thing here is obviously that we can't actually see a proper dip in the frequency response. Yeah? This report doesn't now give us an explanation of why that is. I can tell you that is because it's kind of trumped, or it's kind of overloaded by another effect, right? So there is most likely a reduction of 1.5 decibels at this frequency, but on top of another peak created by a different effect. Right? And so we don't actually see a dip here. But again, this isn't something that the report actually tells us. Something that might be a little confusing if you don't really know what you're looking at. Then we go into this early versus late sound analysis. So here's what that looks like. And this basically gives us a frequency response. Again, a smoothed frequency response, but bracketed in terms of time. So the green line tells us what happens in the first 20 milliseconds in terms of frequency response, and the red line tells us what happens after those first 20 milliseconds of the time response. So 20 milliseconds after the direct sound reached the listening position. And this is an interesting metric again because it shows us how much control we have over the room. Yeah. Obviously, the more sound gets reflected back from the room, the higher in volume that reflected sound will be. And so the closer that red line will be to the green line. Yeah, so again, it gives us an indication of which area of the frequency response, in this case, the low end, we need to work on to reduce the impact of the room. Yeah, so here we can see that for the subwoofer and then for the left and right speakers. I'm not even sure that this is something you can actually do with Room EQ Wizard. There's probably a way to kind of mingle it, but there's no automated function for it. And that basically, from that, then this GRADE report creates this early versus late sound ratio, which is the number that you find up in the table at the top in the summary. And then we go on to the final of the main parts of the analysis, so the time frequency domain analysis, right? So this is where we're looking at the time response, but over frequency. And the first and most kind of obvious part of this analysis is the reverb time, the RT60 analysis. And already it shows us this green line, which is kind of a bracket that you want to be in. And so you can see where your reverb time in your room falls within the bracket that you want to be in and where you're possibly over or even under it. Yeah. Here, this is then the table that just kind of gives you the RT60, the actual reverb times, the average reverb time for each of your monitors. Now, this is interesting to see. I don't talk much about the frequency, the reverb time, because this is a very kind of error-prone measurement. It's very easy for the measurement software or the algorithm to make mistakes when creating this plot. And so I'm quite curious to see what this actually looks like in various different rooms in this GRADE report, because I know that in REW this is not a particularly reliable measurement. Yeah, but it's included here. It is definitely something that you can look at in combination with all the other reverb or decay time attributes or metrics. But so now this is where it gets a bit more interesting. This is the waterfall analysis, and it actually doesn't just spit out the plot, but it actually shows us the lines of where it identifies standing waves in the room. Now the reports, the documentation says it might not find all of them, but the most obvious ones it does show. But more importantly than that, I think this is fantastic. it basically shows us a decay plot for each of those frequencies, right? And this is already, or it's already shown in a 0 to minus 60 decibel range. So we can kind of just read off the actual decay times of these standing waves as they relate to the RT60, right? So this isn't the RT60 itself. This is the decay time of each of these room resonances. But this is a really great way to see just how long the room rings in the lower frequencies in relation to the actual reverb time plot that we saw up here. Yeah, one of the most difficult things to do in a small room is to analyze the actual decay time of the lowest frequencies. And there isn't, up till yet, isn't kind of a real standard on how to do that. It's very dependent on the actual size of the room and the particular room mode pattern that you get. And this gives us a standardized way of looking at the individual resonances on top of the kind of 1 octave number that the reverb time spits out. Yeah, I think this is really, really great. Yeah, and obviously this is the subwoofer, and once again we have the same thing for the individual speakers. And yeah, I think this is a really easy to read and useful graph to describe the performance of the low end. And then it's again summarized in a table here. It's great, just giving us more ways of kind of capturing that data in one single spot. It then moves over to this wavelet diagram. So this shows us time over frequency, but only in the 100 to, what is it, probably 20 kilohertz range. And this is really useful for spotting, as it says up here, reflections. Now, this hasn't been around or hasn't been used in this way for, or it hasn't been popularized, let's say, for very long. So you won't find this very often yet if you're kind of digging through forums and people kind of plotting their or showing their measurements. There is a way to show this in, or to spit out this diagram in Room EQ Wizard as well. The problem is that it's fairly tricky to understand what you're looking at. And it gives us, so the grade report obviously spits out these graphs, but it doesn't really tell us much. It doesn't give us much of an analysis of what you're actually looking at. There's a very broad description of what this plot shows, but you really need to spend some time looking at this to try and figure out what it is. Just as an example, basically what we're seeing here is this, or let me point out this particular line right here, which basically sits at, what is it, 1 point something milliseconds after the direct sound. Yeah, so this is a reflected energy, which is basically the same thing that we saw all the way up here. It's, I can't remember whether we looked at the left or the right speaker. It's basically this thing right here, right? So this peak, which in here isn't related to a particular frequency. Basically, we can see the peak, but we can't tell at what frequencies this energy occurs. But now looking at this wavelet diagram or this wavelet plot, we can now see that this reflection only happens upwards of about 2 kilohertz. Yeah, so this is really, really interesting because it narrows down the reflection pattern to a certain frequency range. Yeah, if you know what you're looking at, this can really help to be more specific with your treatment. And then finally, we get to this ITU RBS 1116 compliance description, I guess, right? So the ITU, or this recommendation, is just that. It's a recommendation, and I'm just going to read it here because this is, I can't really put it any better, is a quality recommendation for broadcasting services describing high-precision audio listening conditions for monitoring applications such as recording studios, post-production, and audio editing, right? So it is a standard set by the ITU to classify post-production or broadcasting services, post-production facilities, professional audio rooms, let's just say it like that, right? And so it gives us again, a metric, a target to hit in terms of frequency response. So it shows us this target corridor by these green lines, and then where we sit in relation to that with our frequency response. Also an early reflection analysis. Basically, you want any peaks after the direct sound to be below -10 decibels, right? And also a reverb time kind of corridor to sit in. We saw this at the top. This is basically a reproduction of the same plot, yeah? And then that all is summarized in this table of compliance. And we can see here, this number is actually what, and I'm just looking at this as well. No, I think this is the number that is also captured in the summary at the very top, right? Then the whole thing is followed up by some terms, and that's pretty much it, yeah? It's a very extensive report in about 30 pages. And if you want to know how your room performs and you have a SAM monitor, then this is a really easy way to get that analysis, right? So if we want to answer the question of whether this thing is any good, this GRADE report, well, the short answer is, yeah, I think it's really good. Because the main problem that we have with software like REW, for example, Room EQ Wizard, it's not so much that it's difficult to do the measurements, although there are plenty of little things that that can trip you up when you're taking the measurements. But the main problem is, how do you then know what to look at and actually analyze that data? Yeah, and this does it for you, and it does it in a way that is very extensive. It basically looks at all the important aspects. If you wanted to compile something like this from a Room EQ Wizard measurement, it would take you hours to export all the graphs and kind of put in all the little details of the analysis, summarize it all in tables. So you get this summary at the very top that is really useful to just get an overall picture, an overall view of how your room performs. But then if you want to dig deeper, you can. Obviously, this isn't going to be understandable for kind of the novice user, right? So if you don't really know much about acoustics, a lot of this is going to be fairly difficult to understand. But it is definitely framed or explained in a way that is pretty much as simple as you can make it without becoming useless. And for somebody like me who talks about acoustics all the time, I know what a difficult balancing act that is. So really kudos to Genelec, hats off. I think they did an excellent job. Yeah. Obviously, you can't expect this to tell you exactly what to do in terms of treatment in your room, right? This is an analysis of the performance of the room. And on top of that, you actually get quite, well, as I just mentioned, you get pretty good explanations of what these different plots show you. And also, some kind of strewn in there somewhere, recommendations of things that you can try to improve the performance. They won't be exact instructions, but they are good indications of what to try. And they also point you or narrow down to particular problems that you can then research and kind of figure out on your own, or basically you can do more research to figure out what you might want to try in order to improve that particular aspect of your room. Now, if there's one little detail that I would nitpick, it's the wavelet description or the explanation of the wavelet plots. Maybe Genelec, you guys can put some more explanations around that with the next upgrade of this report. It is a very useful plot to have, but I think that could do with a bit more kind of explanation and analysis. But to leave the whole thing on a high note, what I like more than anything is that this report gives you targets to meet, both with this summary and the ITU compliance analysis. Yeah. One major issue with project and home studios is that you don't know what you're aiming for. And the ITU recommendation is by no means the end-all be-all of acoustic performance in studios. Yeah, in many ways, it's kind of the lowest common denominator. But at least it gives you a target to reach. And if you have reached that target, you will have decent performance in your room. Yeah, and this is really, really great when we're often shooting blind in terms of what we are treating or what kind of goals to reach when we're treating a room. It's just great to have a target to aim for in the first place. So in summary, I think this is a great push in terms of helping us home studio people figuring out the acoustics in our room. If you have a SAM-enabled monitor, you should totally give this a try. If nothing else, you will learn something about your room. You will learn something about acoustics. You will learn what type of analyses you can actually perform when you're talking about acoustic measurements. So definitely give this a go. For the rest of us, we're stuck with Room EQ Wizard for the moment. And the first step, well, first of all, you can get all this data from Room EQ Wizard. So it's also worth giving that a shot and seeing if you can recreate some of these plots in Room EQ Wizard. Obviously, the first step to do that is actually getting calibrated measurements, because if you want to do before and after comparisons, you really need to measure your system at the same level. And if you need help with that, I've got a Room EQ measurement checklist that you can download for free at the link in the description that will walk you through taking those calibrated measurements with Room EQ Wizard. But then nothing should stop you from going through the different plots in Room EQ Wizard and seeing if you can't basically export them or set them up in a way that they mimic what we're seeing here in the GRADE report. So again, if you want to give that a shot with Room EQ Wizard, download my Room EQ Wizard measurement checklist at the link in the description. So with that, again, Happy New Year. Let's start this one off with a bang, and by getting back to learning to trust our ears and having fun making music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.